Agatha Christie, the voice in the dark. "I am a little worried about Marjorie," said Lady Stranleigh. "My girl, you know," she added. She sighed pensively. "It makes one feel terribly old to have a grown-up daughter." Mr. Satterthwaite, who was the recipient of these confidences, rose to the occasion gallantly. "No one could believe it possible," he declared with a little bow. "Flatterer," said Lady Stranleigh, but she said it vaguely, and it was clear that her mind was elsewhere. Mr. Satterthwaite looked at the slender, white-clad figure in some admiration. The can of sunshine was searching, but Lady Stranleigh came through the test very well. At a distance the youthful effect was really extraordinary. One almost wondered if she were grown up or not. Mr. Satterthwaite, who knew everything, knew that it was perfectly possible for Lady Stranleigh to have grown-up grandchildren. She represented the extreme triumph of art over nature. Her figure was marvellous, her complexion was marvellous. She had enriched many beauty parlours, and certainly the results were astounding. Lady Stranleigh lit a cigarette, crossed her beautiful legs encased in the finest of nude silk stockings, and murmured, "Yes, I really am rather worried about Marjorie." "Dear me," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "what is the trouble?" Lady Stranleigh turned her beautiful blue eyes upon him. "You have never met her, have you? She is Charles's daughter," she added helpfully. If entries in Who's Who were strictly truthful, the entries concerning Lady Stranleigh might have ended as follows: hobbies, getting married. She had floated through life shedding husbands as she went. She had lost 3 by divorce and 1 by death. "If she had been Rudolph's child, I could have understood it," mused Lady Stranleigh. "You remember Rudolph. He was always temperamental. 6 months after we married, I had to apply for those queer things. What do they call them? Conjugal. What-nots, you know what I mean. Thank goodness it is all much simpler nowadays. I remember I had to write him the silliest kind of letter. My lawyer practically dictated it to me, asking him to come back, you know, and that I would do all I could, etc., etc., but you never could count on Rudolph. He was so temperamental. He came rushing home at once, which was quite the wrong thing to do, and not all what the lawyers meant." She sighed. "About Marjorie?" suggested Mr. Satterthwaite, tactfully leading her back to the subject under discussion. "Of course. I was just going to tell you, wasn't I? Marjorie has been seeing things, or hearing them. Ghosts, you know, and all that. I should never have thought that Marjorie could be so imaginative. She is a dear good girl, always has been, but just a shade dull." "Impossible," murmured Mr. Satterthwaite with a confused idea of being complimentary. "In fact, very dull," said Lady Stranleigh. "Doesn't care for dancing or cocktails or any of the things a young girl ought to care about. She much prefers staying at home to hunt instead of coming out here with me." "Dear, dear," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "She wouldn't come out with you, you say?" "Well, I didn't exactly press her. Daughters have a depressing effect upon one, I find." Mr. Satterthwaite tried to think of Lady Stranleigh accompanied by a serious-minded daughter, and failed. "I can't help wondering if Marjorie is going off her head," continued Marjorie's mother in a cheerful voice. "Hearing voices is a very bad sign, so they tell me. It is not as though Abbott's Mead were haunted. The old building was burnt to the ground in 1836, and they put up a kind of early Victorian chateau which simply cannot be haunted. It is much too ugly and commonplace." Mr. Satterthwaite coughed. He was wondering why he was being told all this. "I thought perhaps," said Lady Stranleigh, smiling brilliantly upon him, "that you might be able to help me." "I?" "Yes, you are going back to England tomorrow, aren't you?" "I am. Yes, that is so," admitted Mr. Satterthwaite cautiously. "And you know all these psychical research people. Of course you do. You know everybody." Mr. Satterthwaite smiled a little. It was one of his weaknesses to know everybody. "So what can be simpler?" continued Lady Stranleigh. "I never get on with that sort of person. You know, earnest men with beards and usually spectacles. They bore me terribly, and I am quite at my worst with them." Mr. Satterthwaite was rather taken aback. Lady Stranleigh continued to smile at him brilliantly. "So that is all settled, isn't it?" she said brightly. You will go down to Abbott's Mead and see Marjorie and make all the arrangements. I shall be terribly grateful to you. Of course, if Marjorie is really going off her head, I will come home. Ah, here is Bimbo." Her smile from being brilliant became dazzling. A young man in white tennis flannels was approaching them. He was about 25 years of age and extremely good-looking. The young man said simply, "I have been looking for you everywhere, Babs." "What has the tennis been like?" "Septic." Lady Stranleigh rose. She turned her head over her shoulder and murmured in dulcet tones to Mr. Satterthwaite, "It is simply marvellous of you to help me. I shall never forget it." Mr. Satterthwaite looked after the retreating couple. "I wonder," he mused to himself, "if Bimbo is going to be number 5? 2. The conductor of the train de luxe was pointing out to Mr. Satterthwaite where an accident on the line had occurred a few years previously. As he finished his spirited narrative, the other looked up and saw a well-known face smiling at him over the conductor's shoulder. "My dear Mr. Quin," said Mr. Satterthwaite. His little withered face broke into smiles. "What a coincidence! That we should both be returning to England on the same train. You are going there, I suppose?" "Yes," said Mr. Quin. "I have business there of rather an important nature. Are you taking the first service of dinner?" "I always do so. Of course, it is an absurd time, 6:30, but one runs less risk with the cooking." Mr. Quin nodded comprehendingly. "I also," he said, "we might perhaps arrange to sit together." 6:30 found Mr. Quin and Mr. Satterthwaite established opposite each other at a small table in the dining car. Mr. Satterthwaite gave due attention to the wine list and then turned to his companion. "I have not seen you since— yes, not since Corsica. You left very suddenly that day." Mr. Quin shrugged his shoulders. "Not more so than usual. I come and go, you know. I come and go." The words seemed to awake some echo of remembrance in Mr. Satterthwaite's mind. A little shiver passed down his spine, not a disagreeable sensation, quite the contrary. He was conscious of a pleasurable sense of anticipation. Mr. Quin was holding up a bottle of red wine, examining the label on it. The bottle was between him and the light, but for a minute or two a red glow enveloped his person. Mr. Satterthwaite felt again that sudden stir of excitement. "I too have a kind of mission in England," he remarked, smiling broadly at the remembrance. "You know Lady Stranleigh, perhaps?" Mr. Quin shook his head. "It is an old title," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "A very old title, one of the few that can descend in the female line. She is a baroness in her own right. Rather a romantic history, really." Mr. Quin settled himself more comfortably in his chair. A waiter, flying down the swinging car, deposited cups of soup before them as if by a miracle. Mr. Quin sipped it cautiously. "You are about to give me one of those wonderful descriptive portraits of yours," he murmured. "That is so, is it not?" Mr. Satterthwaite beamed on him. "She is really a marvellous woman," he said. 60, you know. Yes, I should say at least 60. I knew them as girls, she and her sister. Beatrice. That was the name of the elder one. Beatrice and Barbara. I remember them as the Baron girls, both good-looking and in those days very hard up. But that was a great many years ago. Why, dear me, I was a young man myself then. Mr. Satterthwaite sighed. There were several lives then between them and the title. Old Lord Stranleigh was a first cousin once removed. I think Lady Stranleigh's life has been quite a romantic affair. 3 unexpected deaths, 2 of the old man's brothers and a nephew. Then there was the Euralia. You remember the wreck of the Euralia? She went down off the coast of New Zealand. The Baron girls were on board. Beatrice was drowned. This one, Barbara, was amongst the few survivors. 6 months later, old Stranleigh died and she succeeded to the title and came into a considerable fortune. Since then she has lived for one thing only, herself. She has always been the same, beautiful, unscrupulous, completely callous, interested solely in herself. She has had 4 husbands, and I have no doubt could get a 5th in a minute. He went on to describe the mission with which he had been entrusted by Lady Stranleigh. "I thought of running down to Abbott's Mead to see the young lady," he explained. I feel that something ought to be done about the matter. It is impossible to think of Lady Stranleigh as an ordinary mother." He stopped, looking across the table at Mr. Quin. "I wish you would come with me," he said wistfully. "Would it not be possible?" "I'm afraid not," said Mr. Quin. "But let me check. Abbott's Mead is in Wiltshire, is it not?" Mr. Satterthwaite nodded. "I thought as much. As it happens, I shall be staying not far from Abbott's Mead, at a place you and I both know." He smiled. "You remember that little inn? The Bells and Motley?" "Of course," cried Mr. Satterthwaite. "You will be there?" Mr. Quin nodded. "For a week or 10 days, possibly longer. If you will come and look me up one day, I shall be delighted to see you." And somehow or other Mr. Satterthwaite felt strangely comforted by the assurance. 3. "My dear Miss, Marjorie," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "I assure you that I should not dream of laughing at you." Marjorie Gale frowned a little. They were sitting in the large, comfortable hall of Abbott's Mead. Marjorie Gale was a big, squarely built girl. She bore no resemblance to her mother, but took entirely after her father's side of the family, a line of hard-riding country squires. She looked fresh and wholesome, and the picture of sanity. Nevertheless, Mr. Satterthwaite was reflecting to himself that the Barons as a family were all inclined to mental instability. Marjorie might have inherited her physical appearance from her father, and at the same time have inherited some mental kink from her mother's side of the family. "I wish," said Marjorie, "that I could get rid of that Casson woman. I don't believe in spiritualism, and I don't like it. She is one of these silly women that run a craze to death. She is always bothering me to have a medium down here." Mr. Satterthwaite coughed, fidgeted a little in his chair, and then said in a judicial manner, "Let me be quite sure that I have all the facts. The first of the phenomena occurred 2 months ago, I understand." "About that," agreed the girl. "Sometimes it was a whisper, and sometimes it was quite a clear voice, but it always said much the same thing." "Which was?" "Give back what is not yours. Give back what you have stolen." On each occasion I switched on the light, but the room was quite empty and there was no one there. In the end, I got so nervous that I got Clayton, Mother's maid, to sleep on the sofa in my room." "And the voice came just the same?" "Yes, and this is what frightens me. Clayton did not hear it." Mr. Satterthwaite reflected for a minute or two. "Did it come loudly or softly that evening?" "It was almost a whisper," admitted Marjorie. "If Clayton was sound asleep, I suppose she would not really have heard it. She wanted me to see a doctor." The girl laughed bitterly. "But since last night, even Clayton believes," she continued. "What happened last night?" "I am just going to tell you. I have told no one as yet. I had been out hunting yesterday, and we had had a long run. I was dead tired and slept very heavily. I dreamt, a horrible dream, that I had fallen over some iron railings, and that one of the spikes was entering slowly into my throat. I woke to find that it was true. There was some sharp point pressing into the side of my neck, and at the same time a voice was murmuring softly, 'Yon have stolen what is mine. This is death.' I screamed," continued Marjorie, "and clutched at the air, but there was nothing there. Clayton heard me scream from the room next door where she was sleeping. She came rushing in, and she distinctly felt something brushing past her in the darkness, but she says that whatever that something was, it was not anything human." Mr. Satterthwaite stared at her. The girl was obviously very shaken and upset. He noticed on the left side of her throat a small square of sticking plaster. She caught the direction of his gaze and nodded. "Yes," she said. "It was not imagination, you see." Mr. Satterthwaite put a question almost apologetically. It sounded so melodramatic. "You don't know of anyone who has a grudge against you?" he asked. "Of course not," said Marjorie. "What an idea!" Mr. Satterthwaite started on another line of attack. What visitors have you had during the last 2 months? You don't mean just people for weekends, I suppose? Marcia Quin has been with me all along. She's my best friend and just as keen on horses as I am. Then my cousin Rowley Vavasor has been here a good deal. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded. He suggested that he should see Clayton, the maid. She has been with you a long time, I suppose? He asked. Donkey's years, said Marjorie. She was Mother's and Aunt Beatrice's maid when they were girls. That is why Mother has kept her on, I suppose, although she has got a French maid for herself. Clayton does sewing and pottering, little odd jobs. She took him upstairs, and presently Clayton came to them. She was a tall, thin old woman, with grey hair neatly parted, and she looked the acme of respectability. No, sir, she said in answer to Mr. Satterthwaite's inquiries. I have never heard anything of the house being haunted. To tell you the truth, sir, I thought it was all Miss Marjorie's imagination until last night, but I actually felt something, brushing by me in the darkness. And I can tell you this, sir, it was not anything human. And then there is that wound in Miss Marjorie's neck. She didn't do that herself, poor lamb. But her words were suggestive to Mr. Satterthwaite. Was it possible that Marjorie could have inflicted that wound herself? He had heard of strange cases where girls apparently just as sane and well-balanced as Marjorie had done the most amazing things. It will soon heal up, said Clayton. It's not like this scar of mine. She pointed to a mark on her own forehead. That was done 40 years ago, sir. I still bear the mark of it. It was the time the Euralia went down, put in Marjorie. Clayton was hit on the head by a spar, weren't you, Clayton? Yes, miss. What do you think yourself, Clayton? Asked Mr. Satterthwaite. What do you think was the meaning of this attack on Miss Marjorie? I really should not like to say, sir. Mr. Satterthwaite read this correctly, as the reserve of the well-trained servant. What do you really think, Clayton? He said persuasively. I think, sir, that something very wicked must have been done in this house, and that until that is wiped out, there won't be any peace. The woman spoke gravely, and her faded blue eyes met his steadily. Mr. Satterthwaite went downstairs rather disappointed. Clayton evidently held the orthodox view, a deliberate haunting as a consequence of some evil deed in the past. Mr. Satterthwaite himself was not so easily satisfied. The phenomena had only taken place in the last 2 months. Had only taken place since Marcia Quin and Rowley Vavasor had been there. He must find out something about these two. It was possible that the whole thing was a practical joke, but he shook his head, dissatisfied with that solution. The thing was more sinister than that. The post had just come in, and Marjorie was opening and reading her letters. Suddenly she gave an exclamation. "Mother is too absurd," she said. "Do read this." She handed the letter to Mr. Satterthwaite. It was an epistle typical of Lady Stranleigh. "Darling Marjorie," she wrote, "I am so glad you have that nice little Mr. Satterthwaite there. He is awfully clever and knows all the bigwig spook people. You must have them all down and investigate things thoroughly. I am sure you will have a perfectly marvellous time, and I only wish I could be there, but I have really been quite ill the last few days. The hotels are so careless about the— Sweet of you to send me the chocolates, darling, but surely just a well bit silly, wasn't it? I mean, there's such wonderful confectionery out here. Bye-bye, darling, and have a lovely time laying the family ghosts. Bimbo says my tennis is coming on marvellously. Oceans of love. Yours, Barbara. Mother always wants me to call her Barbara, said Marjorie. Simply silly, I think. Mr. Satterthwaite smiled a little. He realized that the stolid conservatism of her daughter must on occasions be very trying to Lady Stranleigh. The contents of her letter struck him in a way in which obviously they did not strike Marjorie. "Did you send your mother a box of chocolates?" he asked. Marjorie shook her head. "No, I didn't. It must have been someone else." Mr. Satterthwaite looked grave. 2 things struck him as of significance. Lady Stranleigh had received a gift of a box of chocolates, and she was suffering from a severe attack of poisoning. Apparently she had not connected these 2 things. Was there a connection? He himself was inclined to think there was. A tall, dark girl lounged out of the morning room and joined them. She was introduced to Mr. Satterthwaite as Marcia Quin. She smiled on the little man in an easy, good-humoured fashion. "Have you come down to hunt Marjorie's pet ghost?" she asked in a drawling voice. "We all rot her about that ghost. Hello, here's Rowley." A car had just drawn up at the front door. Out of it tumbled a tall young man with fair hair and an eager, boyish manner. "Hello, Marjorie," he cried. "Hello, Marcia. I've brought down reinforcements." He turned to the two women who were just entering the hall. Mr. Satterthwaite recognised in the first one of the two the Mrs. Casson of whom Marjorie had spoken just now. "You must forgive me, Marjorie, dear," she drawled, smiling broadly. "Mr. Vavasor told us that it would be quite all right. It was really his idea that I should bring down Mrs. Lloyd with me." She indicated her companion with a slight gesture of the hand. "This is Mrs. Lloyd," she said in a tone of triumph. "Simply the most wonderful medium that ever existed." Mrs. Lloyd uttered no modest protest. She bowed and remained with her hands crossed in front of her. She was a highly coloured young woman of commonplace appearance. Her clothes were unfashionable but rather ornate. She wore a chain of moonstones and several rings. Marjorie Gale, as Mr. Satterthwaite could see, was not too pleased at this intrusion. She threw an angry look at Rowley Vavasor, who seemed quite unconscious of the offence he had caused. "Lunch is ready, I think," said Marjorie. "Good," said Mrs. Casson. "We will hold a séance immediately afterwards. Have you got some fruit for Mrs. Lloyd? She never eats a solid meal before a séance." They all went into the dining room. The medium ate 2 bananas and an apple, and replied cautiously and briefly to the various polite remarks which Marjorie addressed to her from time to time. Just before they rose from the table, she flung back her head suddenly and sniffed the air. "There is something very wrong in this house. I feel it." "Isn't she wonderful?" said Mrs. Casson in a low, delighted voice. "Oh, undoubtedly," said Mr. Satterthwaite dryly. The séance was held in the library. The hostess was, as Mr. Satterthwaite could see, very unwilling. Only the obvious delight of her guests in the proceedings reconciled her to the ordeal. The arrangements were made with a good deal of care by Mrs. Casson, who was evidently well up in those matters. The chairs were set round in a circle, the curtains were drawn, and presently the medium announced herself ready to begin. "6 people," she said, looking round the room. "That is bad. We must have an uneven number. 7 is ideal. I get my best results out of a circle of 7. "One of the servants," suggested Rowley. He rose. "I will rout out the butler." "Let's have Clayton," said Marjorie. Mr. Satterthwaite saw a look of annoyance pass over Rowley Vavasor's good-looking face. "But why Clayton?" he demanded. "You don't like Clayton," said Marjorie slowly. Rowley shrugged his shoulders. "Clayton doesn't like me," he said whimsically. "In fact, she hates me like poison." He waited a minute or two, but Marjorie did not give way. "All right," he said. "Have her down." The circle was formed. There was a period of silence broken by the usual coughs and fidgetings. Presently a succession of raps were heard, and then the voice of the medium's control, a Red Indian called Cherokee. "Indian Brave says you, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Someone here very anxious speak. Someone here very anxious give message to young lady. I go now. The spirits say what she come to say." A pause, and then a new voice, that of a woman, said softly, "Is Marjorie here?" Rowley Vavasor took it upon himself to answer. "Yes," he said, "she is. Who's that speaking?" "I am Beatrice." "Beatrice? Who is Beatrice?" To everyone's annoyance, the voice of the Red Indian Cherokee was heard once more. "I have message for all of you people. Life here very bright and beautiful. We all work very hard. Help those who have not yet passed over." Again a silence, and then the woman's voice was heard once more. "This is Beatrice speaking." "Beatrice who?" "Beatrice Barron." Mr. Satterthwaite leant forward. He was very excited. "Beatrice Barton, who was drowned in the Euralia?" "Yes, that is right. I remember the Euralia. I have a message for this house. Give back what is not yours." "I don't understand," said Marjorie helplessly. "Oh, are you really Aunt Beatrice?" "Yes, I am your aunt." "Of course she is," said Mrs. Casson reproachfully. "How can you be so suspicious? The spirits don't like it." And suddenly Mr. Satterthwaite thought of a very simple test. His voice quivered as he spoke. "Do you remember Mr. Botticetti?" he asked. Immediately there came a ripple of laughter. "Poor old boat's upsetty. Of course." Mr. Satterthwaite was dumbfounded. The test had succeeded. It was an incident of over 40 years ago which had happened when he and the Barron girls had found themselves at the same seaside resort. A young Italian acquaintance of theirs had gone out in a boat and capsized, and Beatrice Barron had jestingly named him Boat's Upsetty. It seemed impossible that anyone in the room could know of this incident except himself. The medium stirred and groaned. "She is coming out," said Mrs. Casson. "That is all we will get out of her today, I'm afraid." The daylight shone once more on the room full of people, 2 of whom at least were badly scared. Mr. Satterthwaite saw by Marjorie's white face that she was deeply perturbed. When they had got rid of Mrs. Casson and the medium, he sought a private interview with his hostess. "I want to ask you 1 or 2 questions, Miss Marjorie. If you and your mother were to die, who succeeds to the tide and estates?" "Rowley Vavasor, I suppose. His mother was Mother's first cousin." Mr. Satterthwaite nodded. "He seems to have been here a lot this winter," he said gently. "You will forgive me asking, but is he fond of you?" "He asked me to marry him 3 weeks ago," said Marjorie quietly. "I said no." "Please forgive me, but are you engaged to anyone else?" He saw the colour sweep over her face. "I am," she said emphatically. "I am going to marry Noel Barton. Mother laughs and says it is absurd. She seems to think it is ridiculous to be engaged to a curate. Why, I should like to know. There are curates and curates. You should see Noel on a horse." "Oh, quite so," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Oh, undoubtedly." A footman entered with a telegram on a salver. Marjorie tore it open. "Mother is arriving home tomorrow," she said. "Bother. I wish to goodness she would stay away." Mr. Satterthwaite made no comment on this filial sentiment. Perhaps he thought it justified. "In that case," he murmured, "I think I am returning so London." The Voice in the Dark. 4. Mr. Satterthwaite was not quite pleased with himself. He felt that he had left this particular problem in an unfinished state. True that, on Lady Stranleigh's return, his responsibility was ended, yet he felt assured that he had not heard the last of the Abbot's Mead mystery. But the next development, when it came, was so serious in its character that it found him totally unprepared. He learnt of it in the pages of his morning paper. "Baroness dies in her bath," as the Daily Megaphone had it. The other papers were more restrained and delicate in their language, but the fact was the same. Lady Stranleigh had been found dead in her bath, and her death was due to drowning. She had, it was assumed, lost consciousness, and whilst in that state her head had slipped below the water. But Mr. Satterthwaite was not satisfied with that explanation. Calling for his valet, he made his toilet with less than his usual care, and 10 minutes later his big Rolls-Royce was carrying him out of London as fast as it could travel. But strangely enough, it was not for Abbott's Mead he was bound, but for a small inn some 15 miles distant, which bore the rather unusual name of the Bells and Motley. It was with great relief that he heard that Mr. Harley Quin was still staying there. In another minute he was face to face with his friend. Mr. Satterthwaite clasped him by the hand and began to speak at once in an agitated manner. "I am terribly upset. You must help me. Already I have a dreadful feeling that it may be too late, that nice girl may be the next to go, for she is a nice girl, nice through and through." "If you will tell me," said Mr. Quin, smiling, "what it is all about." Mr. Satterthwaite looked at him reproachfully. "You know. I am perfectly certain that you know. But I will tell you." He poured out the story of his stay at Abbott's Mead, and as always with Mr. Quin, he found himself taking pleasure in his narrative. He was eloquent and subtle and meticulous as to detail. "So, you see," he ended, There must be an explanation. He looked hopefully at Mr. Quin, as a dog looks at his master. "But it is you who must solve the problem, not I," said Mr. Quin. "I do not know these people." "You do." "I knew the Baron girls 40 years ago," said Mr. Satterthwaite with pride. Mr. Quin nodded, and looked sympathetic, so much so that the other went on dreamily. "That time at Brighton now, Botticetti boats upsetti, quite a silly joke, but how we laughed. Dear, dear, I was young then. Did a lot of foolish things. I remember the maid they had with them. Alice, her name was, a little bit of a thing, very ingenuous. I kissed her in the passage of the hotel, I remember, and one of the girls nearly caught me doing it. Dear, dear, how long ago that all was." He shook his head again and sighed. Then he looked at Mr. Quin. "So you can't help me," he said wistfully. "On other occasions—" "On other occasions you have proved successful owing entirely to your own efforts," said Mr. Quin gravely. "I think it will be the same this time. If I were you, I should go to Abbott's Mead now." quite so," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "As a matter of fact, that is what I thought of doing. I can't persuade you to come with me?" Mr. Quin shook his head. "No," he said. "My work here is done. I am leaving almost immediately." At Abbott's Mead, Mr. Satterthwaite was taken at once to Marjorie Gale. She was sitting dry-eyed at a desk in the morning-room on which was strewn various papers. Something in her greeting touched him. She seemed so very pleased to see him. "Rowley and Marcia have just left. Mr. Satterthwaite, it is not as the doctors think. I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that Mother was pushed under the water and held there. She was murdered, and whoever murdered her wants to murder me too. I am sure of that. That is why—" She indicated the document in front of her. "I have been making my will," she explained. "A lot of the money and some of the property does not go with the title, and there is my father's money as well. I am leaving everything I can to Noel. I know he will make a good use of it, and I do not trust Rowley. He has always been out for what he can get. Will you sign it as a witness?" "My dear young lady," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "you should sign a will in the presence of 2 witnesses, and they should then sign themselves at the same time." Marjorie brushed aside this legal pronouncement. "I don't see that it matters in the least," she declared. "Clayton saw me sign, and then she signed her name. I was going to ring for the butler, but you will do instead." Mr. Satterthwaite uttered no fresh protest. He unscrewed his fountain pen, and then, as he was about to append his signature, he paused suddenly. The name, written just above his own, recalled a flow of memories. Alice Clayton. Something seemed to be struggling very hard to get through to him. Alice Clayton, there was some significance about that. Something to do with Mr. Quin was mixed up with it. Something he had said to Mr. Quin only a very short time ago. Ah, he had it now. Alice Clayton, that was her name. The little bit of a thing. People changed, yes, but not like that. And the Alice Clayton he knew had had brown eyes. The room seemed whirling round him. He felt for a chair, and presently, as though from a great distance, he heard Marjorie's voice speaking to him anxiously. "Are you ill?" "Oh, what is it?" "I'm sure you are ill." He was himself again. He took her hand. "My dear, I see it all now. You must prepare yourself for a great shock. The woman upstairs whom you call Clayton is not Clayton at all. The real Alice Clayton was drowned on the Euralia. Marjorie was staring at him. Who is she then?" "I am not mistaken. I cannot be mistaken. The woman you call Clayton is your mother's sister, Beatrice Barron. You remember telling me that she was struck on the head by a spar? I should imagine that that blow destroyed her memory, and that being the case, your mother saw the chance—" "Of pinching the title, you mean?" asked Marjorie bitterly. "Yes, she would do that. It seems dreadful to say that now she is dead, but she was like that." "Beatrice was the elder sister," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "By your uncle's death she would inherit everything, and your mother would get nothing. Your mother claimed the wounded girl as her maid, not as her sister. The girl recovered from the blow and believed, of course, what was told her, that she was Alice Clayton, your mother's maid, I should imagine that just lately her memory had begun to return, but that the blow on the head, given all these years ago, has at last caused mischief on the brain." Marjorie was looking at him with eyes of horror. "She killed Mother, and she wanted to kill me," she breathed. "It seems so," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "In her brain there was just one muddled idea, that her inheritance had been stolen and was being kept from her by you and your mother." But Clayton is so old." Mr. Satterthwaite was silent for a minute as a vision rose up before him, the faded old woman with grey hair and the radiant golden-haired creature sitting in the sunshine at Cannes. Sisters. Could it really be so? He remembered the Baron girls and their likeness to each other, just because two lives had developed on different tracks. He shook his head sharply, obsessed by the wonder and pity of life. He turned to Marjorie and said gently, "We had better go upstairs and see her." They found Clayton sitting in the little workroom where she sewed. She did not turn her head as they came in for a reason that Mr. Satterthwaite soon found out. "Heart failure," he murmured, as he touched the cold, rigid shoulder. "Perhaps it is best that way."